Hello, I'm Miss Kilburn-Bond and I work with all the English teachers across the Athelstan Trust. In this video I'm going to be talking about the unseen poetry question at the very end of paper 2 from the AQA GCSE English literature paper. This is actually the second of 2 videos on the theme of unseen poetry. In the first video I talked about the bigger mark single poetry question, and then this video sort of works as a follow-up to that. We're just going to be talking about that very final comparative question that's worth 8 marks. The objective of the video is to help you develop a strategy that you can use for approaching that comparative unseen question, making sure that you use that very small amount of time you have at the end of the exam to write something that's going to be really powerful. So if you've not seen that first video, or it's a long time since you saw it, I'm just going to remind you now of the poem that is the focus of that first single poem question. And that poem, the example I gave you, was a poem called Night Writing by Carol Ann Duffy. And it's a poem that you would have already written an essay about the idea of how it explores the process of writing. So I'm just going to read it to you as a reminder. Night Writing by Carol Ann Duffy. Only a neat margin of moonlight there at the curtain's edge, the room like a dark page. I lie in bed. Silence is ink, the sound of my breath dips in and out. So I begin night writing. The stars type themselves far out in space. Who would guess to look at my sleeping face, the rhymes and tall tales I invent? Here be dragons, children lost in the wood, 3 wishes, the wicked and the good. Read my lips. The small hours are poems. Dawn is a rubber. There will be a second unseen poem in the exam paper, and that poem will always be about a similar theme, a similar idea. So for this example, the second poem is called How a Poem Arrives, and it's by Jacob Samler-Rose. Now, even the title of the poem can hopefully already get you to think about how these poems match together. It's about the process of writing poetry again. Sometimes it's just a beginning, nothing more, no directions for where to go next. Sometimes it arrives like furniture, no instructions for assembly, no step by step. Sometimes it's like a dinosaur's bone, like a key that would open a door to something bigger if you knew where to look for the lock. Sometimes it calls you long distance on a bad line and you have to guess every other word. Sometimes it whispers through your dreams, then fades in the morning's light. And sometimes it arrives on your doorstep like a well-known friend, lets itself in, sits down at your desk, and writes itself. So step 1 of the 5 steps to help you with this part of the exam is simply to start by reading the question, identifying the topic you need to focus on. This is exactly the same as step 1 from the previous video when we talked about the single poem question. So you look at the question, you think about exactly what it is you're being asked to focus on, and that will then mean that you're not going to waste time writing about something that's irrelevant. And then that's followed by step 2, which is to read the poem at least twice, thinking really carefully about how it fits the question. You will never write your best answer if you only read the poem once. You need to read it at least 2 times, maybe even more, because each time you'll feel more confident about what you want to say about it. So let's start with our step 1 then. We're going to look at the question and think about what our focus is. Remember, this is just a 10-minute question, so you need to use every moment really wisely. So here's the question. In both Night Writing and How a Poem Arrives, the speakers describe their thoughts about writing poetry. What are the similarities and/or differences between methods the poets use to present these thoughts? And that's for 8 marks. So I've highlighted there in green thoughts about writing poetry, because that is what we're being asked to compare. There's no point writing about any other ideas that might crop up in the poems, because our examiner's asking us just to compare how the speakers describe their thoughts about writing poetry. So that's all we want to think about. But I've also highlighted in yellow the word methods, and that is because the most important thing about this question, and unfortunately the thing about this question that's so often misunderstood, is that it is not a comparison of all the wonderful themes and ideas that you can see between the poems. It has to be driven by a comparison of methods, and methods means what techniques is the poet using in each poem, what techniques are both poets using to get that same or similar idea across. So we're comparing toolboxes. If you watch the first video, that will make sense. We're comparing what tools, what techniques the writers are using, and that has to be our focus for this question. We don't have time to do anything else. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and to read that poem, How a Poem Arrives, at least twice. So by the time we get to step 3, you have already selected your focus from the exam question. So you've focused your mind on what you're looking for, and you've read the poem several times thinking about that focus. So when you get to step 3, it should be a quick decision where you decide to highlight, I would suggest 3 quotations that feel really relevant to that question focus. And I have done that here with my own ideas. There are other quotations in this poem that you could definitely highlight as relevant to the focus. But for me, when I thought about the thoughts about writing poetry, I highlighted the repetition of the word sometimes, because I think that suggests something about how it's not always set in stone how you're going to write a poem, it will change. And then I've selected a couple of other quotations. It arrives like furniture, no instructions for assembly, no step by step, because I like that simile. It whispers through your dreams, then fades in the morning's light. And then it arrives on your doorstep like a well-known friend. So those are my selected quotations. That then leads to step 4, in which you then need to look back at the first poem. So you need to think this is a comparative question. You need to almost have both poems in your hand, like you're weighing them up against each other. Because what you're going to have to do for step 4 is to decide on 2, you might have time for 3, but 2 is fine, comparisons about the way the writers have used language and or the way the writers have used structure. Remember, this question, you're focusing on the writer's method, not ideas. So let's give you an example as to how that could work. So first of all, we've got the 2 poems here side by side, and in the middle we've got our question, with that reminder highlighted, thoughts about writing poetry, and we're only thinking about the methods that the poets use. So what you're trying to find now, 2 or 3 ideas about how the poets are using those methods either similarly or differently. And here's an example that I've done for you. So I've colour-coded my highlighting here to try and help explain how I've focused on the methods that the writer's using to plan my comparison. So first of all, I think I'm going to talk about the repetition of sometimes in the How a Poem Arrives versus the certainty of the declarative sentences in night writing, because both poets are talking about how poetic ideas emerge in the poet's mind, but what happens in How a Poem Arrives is that repeating that word sometimes makes it sound like it's different every time. There's no set way in which poetry arrives in the mind of the writer. But Carol Ann Duffy's speaker seems to be certain, more definite, that the ideas arrive at night in the same way. And those declarative sentences, silence is ink, the small hours are poems, I think gives us that idea really clearly. My next comparative idea I've pulled out is that in both poems I can see evidence of the writer using personification, and that personification gives the poetry a power over the writer's thoughts. So Carol Ann Duffy talks about the stars type themselves far out in space, suggesting that it's the stars that are actually in control of those poetic ideas. Whereas in the Samla Rose poem, then we've got the personification of the poetry that sort of comes and whispers through dreams, arrives on your doorstep like a well-known friend. It even goes on to let itself into the house. So in both poems, I think that personification suggests that the poetry almost comes from a force outside, which could be seen as the imagination coming into the mind and taking over. Then I thought I'd like to look at metaphors, because both poets have used metaphors to explore a similar theme, and that's the idea that poetic ideas lack permanency, and they both seem to suggest that, especially in the daylight, that maybe the brilliance of poetry, the imagination, is often something that's kind of done quietly and almost in the darkness, and that sometimes the reality of the day can take that away or stop those ideas coming. We've got dawn is a rubber, and then we've got the idea of fades in the morning's light in the How a Poem Arrives. And then I also noticed that a good comparison might be to look at narrative voices, because we've got two very different voices here. We've got Carol Ann Duffy's speaker in the first person: I lie in bed, my breath, I begin, I invent, read my lips. Whereas we've got more of a second person narrator here, with the speaker from Sam LaRose's poem saying things like, if you knew, it calls you, your desk. So again, that gives a very different perspective on this process of writing poetry. It seems like a very personal thing for Carol Ann Duffy, for her speaker, but for the speaker in the poem How a Poem Arrives, it seems to be quite a collective experience, that poems do this to all of us, to anyone who's writing a poem. So hopefully what you can see there is that my comparisons are all absolutely focused on method. They're not on ideas first, they're on methods, on the writer's techniques first, and that is the most important thing for you to get from this video. So once you've got those ideas, step 5 is to use your comparisons to help you write 2 or 3 ideas in response to the question. It doesn't have to be a really long answer, it's about the quality and whether you have remembered to focus on method, on the writer's techniques. And I'm deliberately saying this over and over again in the hope that it's the one thing that stays with you. So let's look at an example as to how this might appear in a piece of writing. So this isn't an entirely complete answer, but there's enough here for this to be impressing the examiner, doing what they want to see. So we've got the question again at the top. Remember, we're looking at the 2 poems, the speakers describing their thoughts about writing poetry, and we're picking out similarities and differences between methods that the writers are using to present these thoughts. I've colour-coded them, so in blue is where I'm comparing poetry, where I'm using the language to make comparisons. In red is where I've picked out methods, where I've taken things from the writer's toolkit, and then in green we've got some of the analysis. In both poems, the speakers use personification to present the idea that writing poetry can take over the poet's thoughts and become a power in its own right. Duffy describes the stars as being able to type themselves, implying that their distance from Earth and ability to shine a light in the darkness enables the speaker to be inspired by poetic ideas at night time. This idea that a poem can have a powerful will of its own is also used by the speaker in How a Poem Arrives, as by the end of the poem, poetry is described as sometimes whispering through your dreams and even arriving on your doorstep and letting itself in. In each case, the personification allows the reader to appreciate that imagination can be stronger than conscious control of ideas when writing poetry. The repetition of sometimes in How a Poem Arrives creates a different tone to the certainty created by the speaker's use of declarative sentences in night writing, etc. And obviously that idea is not finished. But what you can see there are 2 comparisons that have been started. One comparing the use of personification, and then just the start of the second idea where the essay writer's looking at repetition and how that compares with the idea of the declarative sentences and the certainty. So everything about those comparisons is about the writer's methods. I really hope that that helps you to see what it is the examiners are looking for. By now you should have developed a strategy in which you can take those 5 steps to approach this comparative unseen poetry question. I hope that's helped. Thanks for listening.